In a silent corner of the Belgian forest, the stillness was broken by the sharp beeping of a metal detector. For decades, these woods had concealed the scars of war, hiding wreckage, bones, and forgotten stories beneath layers of earth and moss. On an October morning in 1984, a lone searcher uncovered not just steel, but a mystery buried for 40 years. Beneath the soil rested an American Sherman tank, swallowed by time. Inside were the remains of 4 men whose disappearance had haunted comrades, commanders, and fathers back home. This was the final resting place of Captain Marcus Sullivan and his crew, warriors who vanished in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge. What unfolded here wasn't just a tale of war and death, but also of courage, loyalty, and even the surprising mercy of enemy soldiers. What really happened in those frozen woods of 1944? And why did it take 4 decades for the truth to be revealed? Before we uncover this forgotten story of men, steel, and sacrifice, make sure to hit like, subscribe for more untold history, and share this video with your brothers in arms who respect the courage of warriors past. The Belgian forest in autumn 1984 was thick with silence, a quiet that felt older than memory itself. Henri Dubois, headphones pressed against his ears, swept his detector across fallen leaves, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. For years, Henri had walked these woods, guided by maps, rumors, and his father's old tales of tanks lost in battle. His passion wasn't treasure, but truth. Fragments of steel that whispered of forgotten warriors. That morning, the detector's hum shifted suddenly into an insistent, urgent beeping. Henri froze, muscles tightening, as if the forest itself had just spoken. This wasn't the faint ping of scattered shell casings. This was deeper, stronger, different. Kneeling among damp ferns, Henri brushed aside soil and moss with his hands. Beneath layers of earth, his fingers struck unyielding metal. He paused, heart racing. It wasn't a rusted helmet. It wasn't a rifle. This was larger, something buried, something waiting. As Henri dug further, fragments of track and thick armor plating revealed themselves, scarred by fire and battle. The weight of realization pressed against his chest. He wasn't uncovering debris. He was touching history itself. He quickly marked the site with bright tape, knowing this find was too vast for one man. The outlines suggested a massive vehicle, a Sherman tank perhaps, resting silently beneath decades of growth. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds fell quiet as Henri stood above the concealed giant. In his mind echoed the words his father once muttered, "Somewhere the Americans disappeared into the trees." The year was 1984. The Cold War-filled newspapers, new machines shaped modern life, and veterans of World War II now sat as grandfathers at their sons' tables. Yet here, the past had clawed its way back. Henri's pulse quickened as he understood the gravity. This wasn't simply a tank. This was a grave. Somewhere inside, entombed in steel, lay the warriors who had vanished without a trace in the Ardennes winter of 1944. News of his discovery spread quickly among officials and historians. Local police arrived first, followed by Belgian defense officers. They all stood in silence, recognizing instantly the importance of what had just been unearthed. Soon, the excavation began under the supervision of battlefield archaeologists. Each layer of soil removed revealed more of the Sherman's form. The familiar gun barrel, twisted armor, and shattered tracks that spoke of violence long past. The turret had been torn partly from the hull, a clear sign of catastrophic damage. Yet the crew compartment remained sealed, untouched since the day it fell silent. The men within had waited 4 decades to be found. Specialists carefully mapped every detail, treating the site as sacred ground. They weren't just digging up steel, they were uncovering men's final stand, the last battlefield of comrades whose courage had been swallowed by time. When the first fragments of personal equipment appeared, a ration tin, a set of dog tags, a battered helmet, Silence fell across the team. These weren't objects. They were echoes of men who had once laughed, cursed, and fought. Every artifact pulled from the soil deepened the story. Shell casings marked desperate defense. Burn scars etched across steel revealed the fury of artillery. And yet, despite the destruction, there lingered a sense of order, of discipline maintained until the end. Day by day, the team worked with reverence. Reporters and historians circled the site, but Henri remained still, watching. He had unearthed many things over the years, but never had he touched a story this profound. This wasn't just history. It was closure waiting to be given. Fathers had died not knowing. Brothers had grown old, wondering. And now, 4 decades later, the truth was clawing its way into daylight. As the final soil was brushed from the Sherman's hull, men stood in awe. The tank had a name etched faintly on its side: Detroit Steel. Its story was about to return, from silence into memory. Autumn 1944 draped Europe in a deceptive calm. The Allies had broken through Normandy, liberated France, and pressed the Germans back to their own borders. Maps in command tents suggested victory was near, but beneath optimism, unease simmered. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff spoke of collapsing German defenses, yet reports from the field told a harsher story. German units that should have been destroyed were regrouping, refitting, and preparing something dangerous. Veteran officers whispered that the enemy was far from finished. The Ardennes region, a landscape of dense forests and steep ridges, was considered a quiet sector. Allied commanders viewed it as unsuitable for large offensives. Thinly spread American divisions held ground while younger replacements gained experience. Soldiers joked about the ghost front, believing little could happen in these mist-covered hills. Yet German patrols moved silently through the undergrowth. Reconnaissance planes crossed overhead at night, and radio intercepts hinted at hidden preparations. The silence was too complete. Local Belgian men, scarred from earlier occupation, warned American officers with hushed voices. They remembered 1940, when promises of protection crumbled and enemy tanks swept through villages. Their nervous glances toward the forests carried weight unheeded by headquarters. Among units stationed there was the 712th Tank Battalion, men hardened from North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. Once full of eager recruits, by late 1944 they were veterans shaped by steel, smoke, and countless battles survived by inches. Their Shermans, nicknamed Ronsons for how quickly they ignited, were dependable but vulnerable. Against the German Panthers and Tigers, they were outgunned and under-armored. Survival demanded cunning, teamwork, and commanders who could read terrain like scripture. Inside a Sherman, 5 men worked in crushing proximity. The commander, perched high, scanned horizons through narrow vision slits. The gunner and loader labored in rhythm. The driver and bow gunner endured the rattle and roar of endless miles. The noise was ceaseless, engines growling, shells exploding, metal ringing with incoming fire. The air inside was hot, acrid with exhaust, cordite, and sweat. Days felt like weeks. A man could grow old in hours of battle. Psychological strain pressed heavily. Crews relied on ritual, morning checks, shared meals, short jokes between engagements. A tank crew became more than comrades. They became brothers, fused by trust, survival, and the knowledge their lives were interlocked. One such commander was Captain Marcus Sullivan. Raised in Detroit, son of a factory worker and younger brother to 3 steel mill men, he grew up breathing machinery, bolts, and the scent of oil. As a teenager, Sullivan rebuilt engines in his father's garage. By 16, he could strip and reassemble a Model A block blindfolded. His mechanical gift, paired with calm confidence, marked him as a natural leader when war erupted. After Pearl Harbor, Sullivan enlisted immediately. Training at Fort Knox, he excelled in tactics, gunnery, and mechanical repair. Instructors noted his steady nerves. Where others panicked, he calculated, deliberate and unshaken. His men soon called him Steel. By 1944, Steel Sullivan had led tanks across North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. His Sherman, painted Detroit Steel in block letters, was trusted by infantry who knew it would be there when firepower mattered most. His crew were seasoned men. Sergeant Tommy "Wrench" Rodriguez, a gunner with unmatched accuracy. Corporal Billy "Lucky" O'Brien, a driver with instinctive navigation skills. And Private Jake "Kid" Morrison, the loader whose youthful energy masked hard-learned discipline. They were more than names. They were men bound by steel, smoke, and countless close calls. In quiet moments, they sharpened tools, swapped jokes, or traded stories of fathers, brothers, and uncles who had shaped their lives. By November, as the battalion shifted into Ardennes positions, Sullivan sensed unease. German artillery had gone quiet, patrols less frequent. He told his commander it felt like the enemy was holding its breath. No one wanted to believe him. What seemed like a quiet sector was, in truth, a powder keg. Beyond the tree line, 3 German armies gathered, ready to strike. The stage was set for Hitler's final gamble, and for Detroit Steel to vanish. Captain Marcus Sullivan was the heart of the Sherman called Detroit Steel. Calm under fire, precise in decision, he carried the weight of leadership with quiet authority. His men trusted him absolutely. Their survival depended on it. Sullivan had grown up in Detroit among the clang of forges and the pounding of assembly lines. His father bent steel on the Ford line, while his brothers worked as machinists, welders, and tool makers. Discipline was forged in iron. He learned responsibility early, repairing worn-out engines in his father's garage. To him, machines weren't puzzles, but companions with personalities. This understanding later made him invaluable in armored warfare, where breakdowns often killed faster than bullets. In training, instructors noticed how Sullivan stayed composed under pressure. He never barked orders in panic. Instead, he analyzed, explained, and led with certainty. His men didn't just respect him. They leaned on him like brothers. His gunner, Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, carried a different gift. Nicknamed Wrench for his mechanical skill, he could fix a jammed turret in minutes. Behind the sights, his accuracy was legendary. Shells struck where words pointed. Rodriguez grew up in San Antonio, son of a carpenter. His uncles drilled him in patience and craftsmanship. To him, shooting a tank gun wasn't destruction. It was carpentry with fire, measuring twice, cutting once. Corporal Billy O'Brien was the driver. Known as Lucky, he had uncanny instincts for terrain. Raised in Boston, he learned to navigate tight city streets from his truck-driving father and uncles. In battle, that skill saved lives. Lucky could sense mud before wheels touched it, spot hidden ditches, and weave through obstacles with impossible timing. Where other Shermans bogged down, Detroit Steel kept rolling. His gift turned survival from chance into calculation. Private Jake Morrison, the youngest, filled the loader's position. Nicknamed Kid, he was only 19 but carried himself like a veteran. Quick hands, strong arms, and relentless energy defined him. He made the main gun sing. Morrison grew up on a Tennessee farm with his father and older brothers. Chores hardened him, lifting, hauling, stacking. To him, loading shells was no harder than tossing hay bales. The work was second nature. Together, the crew of Detroit Steel functioned like a single living organism. No wasted words. A glance, a nod, a grunt conveyed everything. Years of fighting had compressed them into one heartbeat, one rhythm of survival. Their Sherman wasn't the most powerful machine in the war, but within its steel hull, discipline and trust became weapons. Where tigers prowled with brute strength, Detroit Steel endured with cunning, timing, and brotherhood. Between battles, the men carved out moments of humanity. Sullivan insisted on routines, daily checks, meals shared, gear cleaned. They swapped letters from fathers, brothers, and uncles. They smoked together, laughed together, and endured nightmares together. Each man carried tokens from home. Sullivan kept a worn compass his father had used as a factory foreman. Rodriguez carried rosary beads given by his uncle. O'Brien kept a pocket knife from his older brother. Morrison clutched a harmonica. These objects weren't luxuries. They were anchors. In the chaos of battle, small reminders of men who had shaped them kept their resolve sharp. They weren't fighting as individuals. They were extensions of their father's legacies. Detroit steel became known among infantrymen who whispered with relief when the Sherman appeared. Its arrival meant support, precision fire, and a crew that never abandoned soldiers on foot. For many, Sullivan's tank was a guardian. By late 1944, the four men had survived more than most battalions. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and hedgerows, outlasting odds that destroyed countless crews. Each scar on their tank told a story of fire escaped. But survival wasn't guaranteed. They knew the arithmetic of armor. Each mission could be their last. And as December drew near, Detroit steel was ordered into the Ardennes, a quiet sector, or so everyone believed. The first weeks of December 1944 seemed deceptively calm in the Ardennes. Snow dusted the ridgelines, rivers froze along their edges, and American soldiers began to believe this was finally a place to breathe. Captain Marcus Sullivan, standing in the hatch of Detroit steel, didn't believe the quiet. His instincts, sharpened through years of combat, told him the silence was too heavy. Something hidden stirred beyond the trees. On December 1st, Sullivan received orders to advance toward an observation post closer to enemy lines. Routine, headquarters said, nothing unusual. But Rodriguez muttered, "Sir, feels like the whole forest's holding its breath." The Sherman rumbled forward, O'Brien weaving it through frozen trails while Morrison checked ammunition. Rodriguez scanned through optics, tense as ever. The crew's banter was gone. They felt the same unease Sullivan carried deep inside. At 0847, shadows shifted in the tree line. Sullivan spotted unnatural movement, not deer, not wind. He radioed headquarters, reporting contacts in grid 245678. "Investigating," he said. They were his last words over the net. Suddenly, the forest erupted. German artillery thundered across miles, shells ripping through American positions. The ground shook violently. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate gamble, had begun with overwhelming fire and steel. Columns of German armor surged forward, panthers, tigers, and mechanized infantry. American lines shattered under the surprise. Young divisions, untested, were swallowed whole. Radios crackled with broken cries, encircled, heavy losses, enemy everywhere. Detroit steel plunged into chaos. Sullivan barked orders, O'Brien maneuvered hard to cover, Rodriguez fired round after round, Morrison loaded without pause. Shell casings piled at his feet as the gun roared against advancing shadows. The battle was confusion incarnate. Fog mingled with smoke, visibility cut to nothing. German infantry swarmed the roads, firing Panzerfausts from tree lines. Explosions lit the sky. For tank crews, every second teetered between life and annihilation. Across the battalion net, voices screamed and vanished. "Steel 2, taking fire near Crinkled." Static. "Steel 4 hit, withdrawing." Silence. Sullivan's calls for support were met with chaos, each message lost in the storm. Rodriguez's gunnery bought them breathing space. 2 half-tracks burst into flame, infantry scattered. But then, the unmistakable crack of an 80-mm cannon thundered. A Tiger had locked them in its crosshairs. The round struck near their tracks, immobilizing the Sherman. Sparks and steel shrieked. O'Brien swore, hands wrestling controls. Sullivan ordered smoke deployed, trying desperately to obscure their position as German armor closed in. Pinned in place, Detroit steel fought like a cornered animal. Rodriguez fired again and again, Morrison's arms aching from relentless loading. Sullivan shouted target coordinates, his calm voice cutting through the terror. But the forest was no sanctuary. A second hit rocked the tank, rupturing the transmission. The Sherman lurched, crippled. Inside, heat, smoke, and fumes filled their lungs. Still, the men clung to their posts. American positions collapsed all around. Entire regiments were swallowed by the German advance. Sullivan's crew was cut off, isolated, a single Sherman in a storm of steel. Yet they refused to abandon the fight. In those hours, no one knew the larger picture. Eisenhower's headquarters reeled. German commanders pressed forward ruthlessly, aiming to split the Allied front and seize Antwerp. The Ardennes was no longer quiet. It was hell unleashed. And within that inferno, Detroit steel disappeared. No messages, no sightings, no return. 4 men, bound by brotherhood and steel, were swallowed by history's most desperate gamble, vanishing into the white chaos of the Bulge. When the opening barrage of the Bulge subsided, commanders scrambled for reports. Radios crackled with fragments, but Detroit steel was silent. Captain Marcus Sullivan and his crew had vanished into the fog of war. Colonel James Harrison, commanding the 712th Tank Battalion, refused to write them off. He had known Sullivan as steady, reliable, not the kind of man to simply disappear. Still, battle swallowed units whole without warning. Reconnaissance patrols were dispatched when possible, threading through frozen villages and broken roads. They searched for hulks of Shermans, burned-out wrecks that might carry familiar numbers. Yet each find brought disappointment. Detroit steel remained missing. German forces pressed relentlessly, making searches nearly impossible. One day a field might be American-held, the next it was overrun. Patrols returned shaken, reporting smoke pillars, wreckage, and enemy armor moving like predators through the mist. Local Belgian men shared what they'd seen. One swore he heard a tank engine groaning near the woods on December 1st. Another claimed to see Germans examining a disabled Sherman before dragging it away. Confusion ruled the day. Too many tanks burned, too many units fractured. Soldiers whispered that Sullivan's crew might have been captured, or worse, destroyed in such a way nothing remained. Uncertainty gnawed at every man. Back home, absence carried its own torment. Fathers waited for official word, scanning letters that never arrived. Brothers wondered whether Sullivan, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Morrison were still alive, or whether they had died unseen in the Ardennes snow. The U.S. Army's Graves registration units searched once front lines stabilized. They scoured wrecks, cataloged serial numbers, matched artifacts to missing men. Each discovery brought closure to some, but not to the kin of Detroit steel. Months passed, then years. Inquiries stacked up. Personal effects surfaced elsewhere, but none linked to Sullivan's crew. Official files marked them missing in action. For their comrades, it was an open wound that refused to close. At battalion reunions after the war, veterans spoke of Sullivan in low voices. Some swore he had survived and been taken prisoner. Others believed his tank still lay hidden, entombed in the Ardennes earth. Legends grew. Belgian boys in nearby villages spoke of hearing engines deep in the woods on quiet nights. Men clearing fields claimed metallic shapes glimmered where no scrap should exist. The mystery refused to die. Rodriguez's brother in San Antonio kept his rosary beads untouched, waiting. O'Brien's father hired an investigator to walk Belgian fields in 1949, chasing rumors and fragments. Morrison's older brothers wrote letters to veterans groups across Europe. Each effort ended in silence. The forest kept its secret. American files closed, moving on to new wars, new missing men. But for those who had known the crew, hope smoldered stubbornly. Colonel Harrison, even in retirement, kept files on Sullivan. He spoke of his captain at reunions, insisting, "Steele didn't just vanish. He's out there, waiting." His voice carried conviction, but no evidence followed. By the 1960s, the Battle of the Bulge had become history in books and lectures. Yet among veterans, the missing tank was a ghost story. whispered with awe, frustration, and grief unresolved. Every unmarked wreck discovered in the Ardennes sparked rumors. Maybe that's Detroit steel, someone would say. Each time investigators checked, hopes crumbled. Still, no trace of Sullivan's tank surfaced. No remains returned to waiting kin. The decades wore on, but the mystery held tight. The Ardennes forest grew thicker, moss reclaiming scars of war. Somewhere beneath roots and soil, 4 men remained unaccounted for, ghosts of Detroit steel. And so, the story lingered, unsolved. Brothers, fathers, comrades, and commanders carried questions with no answers. Sullivan and his crew had disappeared, and time itself seemed determined to keep their fate hidden. As the decades passed, the Ardennes forest grew wilder. Trees stretched tall where craters once yawned, and moss smothered rusted helmets, shell casings, and twisted wrecks. Yet whispers of a missing tank never faded. Belgian men who had lived through occupation told stories to their sons. They spoke of an American Sherman vanishing during the first morning of the German offensive. Some claimed its engines still echoed at night. Children grew into men, repeating tales of ghostly clanking in the woods. Hunters swore they glimpsed metallic shadows glimmering under moonlight. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, but the myth of Detroit steel spread wider. Among American veterans, the tank became a symbol. At reunions, men swapped theories over drinks, ambush, capture, destruction, or concealment. None had proof, but all agreed that Sullivan and his crew deserved to be found. Rodriguez's brother held on to his rosary beads, refusing to believe his sibling gone forever. O'Brien's father kept his son's knife sharpened, a ritual of remembrance. Morrison's older brothers saved every letter the kid had written. For them, silence was heavier than death. A grave would bring mourning, but absence left questions that gnawed without end. Every rumor, every story from the Ardennes sparked a fresh surge of hope. In the 1960s and 70s, amateur historians roamed the forests with new detectors. Most finds were helmets, bayonets, or fragments of artillery. Yet some swore they felt signals too deep, too large, to be ordinary scrap. One of those men was Henri Dubois, son of a Belgian farmer who had once claimed to see a Sherman vanish near his property. Henri grew up fascinated by that tale. He became a battlefield searcher, combing the Ardennes on weekends. At first, he collected small relics, buttons, bullets, canteens. But his real obsession was the missing Sherman, the ghost his father had spoken of. By the late 1970s, Henri had developed a reputation. Museums and historians consulted him for artifacts. Veterans visiting Belgium sought his guidance, yet his most relentless quest was still unfinished: Detroit steel. He studied archives, interviewed surviving officers, and retraced battle reports. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that the Sherman still rested somewhere beneath layers of soil and roots. Each time his detector pulsed with a deep signal, hope surged. More often than not, he uncovered farm equipment, discarded pipes, or wreckage from smaller vehicles, but he never stopped, believing one day he'd find the truth. Veterans admired his persistence. American men wrote letters urging him on. Some sent maps marked with hand-drawn arrows. This was near where Steel 6 was last heard. Henri filed them carefully, each clue another thread. In those forests, every artifact whispered of sacrifice. Dog tags carried names long forgotten by bureaucrats. Helmets bore dents where men had fallen. To Henri, they weren't just relics. They were messages from the dead. Still, one mystery overshadowed them all. Detroit steel remained missing. Sullivan, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Morrison lingered as phantoms. To some, they were legends. To others, they were just another tragedy swallowed by war. But legends have gravity. They draw men forward, refusing to let the past stay buried. By the early 1980s, Henri's conviction sharpened. He knew the Sherman was out there. The forest was hiding it. On a misty morning in October 1984, his detector shrieked louder than ever before. The deep, urgent signal told him this was no helmet, no rifle. Something enormous slumbered beneath the earth. And so, the ghost of Detroit steel stirred again. After 40 years of silence, the forest was ready to reveal what it had kept hidden, and the truth waiting inside would shock the world. Henri Dubois stood frozen, staring at the detector's unwavering signal. He had uncovered helmets, rifles, even grenades before. But this was deeper, stronger. His instincts screamed something massive, something hidden was waiting beneath. With careful hands, he began scraping earth. Soon, cold steel revealed itself, thick, curved armor plating scarred by violence. A track segment jutted from the soil. This was no scrap. This was a Sherman. Authorities were called immediately. Local police arrived first, then Belgian defense officials. They stood silently as Henri pointed to the rising outline of the buried tank. Everyone knew this wasn't salvage. This was history. Within days, archaeologists, engineers, and soldiers assembled. They approached not with shovels of haste, but with brushes of reverence. Each layer of soil was peeled away carefully, as if uncovering a tomb long sealed. The turret appeared first, twisted and half-separated from the hull, evidence of catastrophic damage. Yet the crew compartment below remained sealed, preserved by steel. For 40 years, it had waited untouched. Artifacts emerged: an ammunition crate, a rusted canteen, a ration tin marked U.S. Army. Each piece told a fragment of a story, painting a picture of men holding on in impossible conditions. Then came the first remains. In the driver's position lay bones still intact, shielded by armor. Dog tags identified Corporal Billy O'Brien. His nickname, Lucky, carved on a pocket knife, lay near his skeletal hand. Excavators paused, hats removed. Silence filled the forest. These were no longer rumors or legends. These were men, brothers in arms, waiting decades for their names to be spoken aloud again. Soon after, the gunner's remains surfaced. Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez sat in his post, rosary beads wrapped tightly around his fingers. His small notebook, miraculously preserved, recorded ammunition counts up to his final hour. Private Jake Morrison was found next. Shell casings surrounded him, proof of his desperate loading until the end. His harmonica rested near his ribs, a relic of youth carried into the steel coffin. Finally, Captain Marcus Sullivan was uncovered in the commander's seat, leaning near the radio. Around his neck still hung a small compass, the one his father had passed down to guide him through life. Forensic experts examined the tank closely. Evidence suggested the crew survived after their Sherman was disabled. Food tins showed signs of careful rationing. Makeshift bedding revealed they had endured at least 3 days before the final blast. Most shocking of all, German rations and medical supplies were discovered inside. Enemy soldiers had found Detroit's steel, and instead of finishing the crew, had offered aid. Acts of mercy in the middle of hell. The forensic timeline was grim. After days of survival, a direct artillery strike finally tore through the hull, killing the crew instantly. Preserved by steel and soil, their story waited decades to be uncovered. News spread worldwide. Newspapers printed headlines: "Lost Sherman found in Ardennes." Television cameras filmed the excavation, but no broadcast could capture the weight felt by men standing there, gazing into steel silence. Veterans traveled to Belgium, some breaking down at the sight of the tank. For them, it was more than history. It was closure. Sullivan, Rodriguez, O'Brien, and Morrison were no longer missing. Artifacts were carefully preserved. The rosary beads, compass, knife, and harmonica were catalogued. Each object would later be displayed in museums, not as trophies, but as testaments to the humanity of men at war. Detroit steel, once thought a ghost, had returned. The Ardennes no longer held its secret. And as the excavation closed, the world realized the story was not just about death, but about endurance, brotherhood, and mercy. The discovery of Detroit steel reverberated across nations. It wasn't simply the recovery of a tank. It was the resurrection of 4 men whose courage had been swallowed by decades of silence. Their story demanded remembrance. In America, military officials arranged ceremonies. Captain Marcus Sullivan was laid to rest with full honors at Arlington, his compass buried with him. Veterans saluted quietly, knowing his leadership had carried men through battles most never returned from. Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez was buried in San Antonio. His brother received the rosary beads clutched in his hands, now treasured as a relic of unshakable faith. His grave became a gathering place for veterans seeking strength. Corporal Billy O'Brien was interred in Massachusetts. His father held the pocketknife found beside him, blade dulled but spirit intact. It was placed on display near his marker, symbol of a driver who never faltered. Private Jake Morrison was buried in Tennessee. His older brothers stood silent as his harmonica was placed nearby. Though the kid had left as a boy, he returned remembered as a warrior whose hands never stopped loading. Each ceremony echoed with the weight of closure. Fathers, brothers, uncles, comrades, all could finally lower heads knowing the missing had returned. Silence was replaced by prayers, taps, and the thunder of rifle salutes. Historians examined the find with awe. Evidence of German soldiers aiding trapped Americans challenged the common narrative of absolute enmity. It reminded the world that even in war, men sometimes chose mercy over brutality. The tank itself became a relic. Its damaged gun was displayed in a museum alongside the artifacts. Visitors stood quietly, not just staring at steel, but feeling the humanity it once sheltered. For veterans, the story of Detroit steel validated decades of sacrifice. Many feared their service would fade into statistics. Now here was proof. Individual stories still mattered, even after 40 years in the ground. The excavation also reshaped military policy. It proved that missing personnel could still be found decades later. Funding expanded for battlefield archaeology, ensuring that no man's story would remain buried if evidence lingered. In Belgium, the site of discovery became an unofficial memorial. Soldiers, historians, and sons of veterans traveled there, laying flags or quiet notes. Henri Dubois often greeted them, guarding the ground with reverence. For him, the find wasn't just about steel. It was about fulfilling his father's memory, proving that the ghost of the Sherman had been real and that the men within deserved remembrance. Decades later, a German veteran came forward. He admitted to helping the trapped crew, slipping them rations and medical supplies. His testimony confirmed the forensic evidence, revealing that compassion had cut across enemy lines. He described Sullivan's calm presence, his gratitude spoken in broken German. He remembered sharing a photograph of his own father, and Sullivan responding by pointing to his compass, symbol of home and guidance. The veteran confessed he had carried guilt for years, knowing he couldn't save them. Yet his choice had kept them alive days longer, proof that even in war, conscience could prevail. His words cemented the legacy. Detroit steel wasn't just about death in a frozen forest. It was about courage, loyalty, and the human decency that sometimes flickers even in humanity's darkest hours. Today, the story is taught in classrooms, told at reunions, and remembered by sons and grandsons of veterans. Detroit steel reminds men that sacrifice is never forgotten, and brotherhood can echo across generations. And so, in a Belgian forest where moss still grows thick, the legacy of Detroit steel endures. 4 men rest in honored graves, their silence broken, their courage remembered forever in steel and story.